It seems like everyone is buying Fuji cameras these days, especially in certain genres of photography, like street photography. And I don't consider myself a street photographer, but I also don't really fit neatly into any particular genre. I'm kind of somewhere in between street photography and landscape photography. I usually shoot handheld. I'm generally just walking around and taking photos of places. And sometimes that's in cities, sometimes it's in wilderness areas. A lot of times it's sort of in between. But my photography feels similar in style to a lot of people who are buying and seem to be enjoying Fuji cameras. So I've been intrigued for a while. Have I been missing out on anything? Would I miss anything from the big fancy full frame Sony cameras that I've used for years? Is it all hype, or is there actually something special about these small APS-C Fujifilm cameras? So I've been using Sony cameras since late 2015 and full frame cameras for almost that long. And they've been perfectly fine. I'm really happy with the portfolio that I've built over the years. I don't really have any issues with the menu system or the ergonomics or any of the common complaints about Sony cameras, but except for some really old Canon DSLRs like 20 plus years ago, I haven't actually spent very much time with any of the other brands' offerings. So I don't really know whether I'd be enjoying any of those more than I like the Sonys. I might be missing out. Maybe I did just happen to buy the best system for me when I first bought the Sony cameras 10 years ago, but maybe another brand would be a better fit for my needs. I know that there won't be any major differences between any of the brands these days, and I also know that it just doesn't really matter all that much, but I've been curious. So there are a few things in particular that specifically drew me into the Fuji cameras. The colors and the process of editing the files, people seem to really enjoy that and talk highly about that. The experience of using the camera, the smaller size, especially with the tiny prime lenses, and the fact that it's all quite a bit cheaper than the equivalent gear from Sony or Canon or whoever else. 40 megapixels on these newer ones, like the X-T5 and the X106, seemed like plenty. I've used 24 megapixel cameras, I've used 42 megapixel cameras, my current one's 60 something, they've all been fine, and I know that 40 is plenty for me. The autofocus in the past, I think, was a lot worse on the Fuji cameras. It's, I think, gotten pretty close, but probably not quite as good as the Sony ones now. But it seems like they are more than good enough for my style of photography, for my particular needs, even though they're probably not quite as good on paper. But overall, it just seemed like a camera system that really checked all of the boxes that I need and still had some interesting potential benefits compared to the fancy full frame Sony gear. So, kind of on a whim, I bought a Fuji X-T5 along with the 23, the 35, and the 50mm f2 prime lenses. I bought them all used from KEH, and I've had them for about a month now. The plan is to use them for a bit and then decide whether I like them enough to potentially replace all of my Sony gear, or maybe just use it alongside the Sony gear for certain projects. I would like to have just all of one brand and not have lots of different cameras, but we'll see. I've used this new setup on a handful of different photo walks around Seattle, and I also helped out some friends by shooting a few photos at their wedding. I'm not a wedding photographer. I don't want to be a wedding photographer. I was just doing them a favor, but it was definitely a good test of the camera in a demanding environment, especially on the autofocus front. It's still early stages, but we'll talk about my thoughts on whether this was a good decision, and whether it seems like the kind of camera that I might keep for the long run or not. Let's talk about a few things that I've noticed so far. We'll talk about the experience of using the camera, talk about the image quality, and then specifically talk about the colors and how it feels to edit the raw files. And then a few other things along the way, like the menu system that seems to be really important for a lot of people. So using the camera. We'll talk about the size, the ergonomics, the layout, how it feels in general. We'll talk about the autofocus and how that feels. And then we'll talk about aspect ratios, which might sound kind of weird, but I'll explain when we get there. So how the camera feels to use and hold. It definitely feels a little bit smaller and lighter than the Sony, especially with these tiny prime lenses. And I know that Sony makes smaller cameras now, even full frame ones. And I'm comparing it to mostly using the Sony with the 24-105, which is not at all an apples to apples comparison. But even so, it definitely does just feel a little bit smaller and lighter. And that's nice. It's not that much smaller. Like if you hold them side by side, this is my smallest lens on the Sony, even though it's not the one that I use the most. It's smaller, it's lighter, but it's not a huge difference. So like that in and of itself isn't enough for me to switch, but it's a nice bonus. The grip on the Fuji is much shallower, like where your fingers go, much shallower there. I don't like that so far nearly as much. The Sony one is much deeper. I can just kind of like hold my fingers in there, and it feels more secure if I'm just holding it in one hand for hours at a time, like with a wrist strap. But the Fuji is also light enough to where I'm really comfortable wearing it around my neck with a neck strap, which I don't do that often with the Sony because it gets kind of tiring there. So it's fine overall, just kind of trading a little bit of size and weight, and then just using the neck strap instead of carrying it in my hand. But then my hands are free if it's a neck strap. You know what that's like. So overall, I do like the layout of the buttons and stuff. It's nice to have the ISO and shutter speed super easily accessible like that, but I do find that the vast majority of the time I just leave both of those in auto, and I'm shooting in aperture priority mode with the aperture dial directly on the lens. And some of my Sony lenses have the aperture dial there, and that's nice, but the ones that I've historically used the most don't. So in some ways, this feels kind of new to me, and I'm enjoying it so far. It's nice just to be able to fairly quickly and tactilely, I don't know, like without having to scroll and look at settings, just know that like, oh, all the way there's F2, and then that's F16 somewhere over there. I'm not shooting at F16 much, but overall I'm enjoying how the camera feels to hold and use. The viewfinder feels better than the Sony a7R4. There are newer Sony cameras that definitely have better viewfinders, but this one with the Fuji feels nice. I like the flip out screen. It's got the same kind of flippy tilty one that the a7R4 has, which is nice. I prefer that over the kind that flips out for photography, but it's nice that this one also flips that way. So if I'm shooting down low vertically or up high vertically, I can see the screen better. And I know the a7R5 has a new screen like that, but I haven't used that camera. This is nice. Let's talk about the autofocus. Maybe autofocus is the most important thing for you. It's not for me. I'm not a wedding photographer. Like I said, I helped a friend out and did a little bit of photography during their wedding last weekend, and I can definitely tell that the autofocus isn't quite as good as the Sony. But it's also plenty good, and it's more than good enough for the kind of photography that I actually do on a regular basis. And then aspect ratio. I've always just used the 3:4 aspect ratio in camera in the Sony for composing my vertical pictures, and then knowing that I have to crop a little bit more off the top and the bottom because I shoot all of my vertical shots at a 4:5 aspect ratio. I think it looks best. It's a fairly standard print size. It works on social media. All of my vertical shots, with like one exception, are a 4:5 aspect ratio. And frankly, it was really annoying that on the Sony cameras, you couldn't shoot at a native 4:5 aspect ratio, or not native, but you couldn't shoot at a 4:5 aspect ratio in camera. Not the end of the world, but like, come on, it's a standard aspect ratio. Like, just let me compose in camera at the aspect ratio that I want to shoot. It's not some obscure thing. 4:5 is very standard, but you can do that on the Fuji. And it has been so nice to be able to just compose in camera how I want the photo to look. And I know I can always crop, but it's nice to be able to just compose in camera how I want the photo to look. And so that, in and of itself, is almost enough for me to switch away from Sony to Fuji or any other brand that has a 4:5 aspect ratio. How hard would it be for them to just have a custom aspect ratio option where you could do 4:5 or 5:7 or panoramic 3:1 or whatever? Like, it's just an overview, like an overlay. They do it for a handful of aspect ratios. Just give us a few more, or let us customize aspect ratios. But at least the Fuji has the 4:5 option, and for that, I'm very grateful. All right, let's talk about image quality overall. it's not something that I particularly care very much about once I'm past a certain threshold. If it is a high enough resolution, which all of these are, if the lenses are sharp enough, which all of these are, if they do a good enough job at dynamic range and high ISO performance, then it's fine. And both of these cameras are totally fine. Of course, the Sony is going to be a little bit better on paper. It's higher resolution. It probably has a higher dynamic range. It probably is better at higher ISOs, but I don't notice that when I'm shooting the Fuji. I'm not bringing these photos into Lightroom and being like, this feels like a downgrade, because it doesn't feel like a downgrade. It just feels like a different camera, and that's nice. If like sharpness and the absolute best on paper image quality is the most important thing to you, then like a Sony a7R5 or like a medium format Fuji GFX 100S or something like that, maybe that's worth it. For me, those just are not the most important things, and the image quality is so good on these Fuji cameras that it just doesn't really feel like a downgrade to me. So not like a very scientific comparison there. I haven't shot the same scene side by side and zoomed in, but like I'm not going to. This isn't like a, is Sony better than Fuji, all, you know, full stop kind of video. It's just, do I like the experience of using the Fuji enough to potentially use it? And I'd say on the image quality front, yeah, it's plenty good. But the color and the editing was the thing that I was most intrigued by, most curious about. And the Fuji camera feels a little bit like shooting film again, but with a lot of the benefits of digital too. Thinking back, the crazy thing is that some of my favorite images in the last 5 or 10 years were taken with a cheap plastic point and shoot film camera from the 1990s, the Olympus Stylus Zoom. I think I had the 35 to 70 millimeter option. But those photos are not very sharp, especially on the edges. The vignetting is bad. In so many ways, it's a technically terrible camera. I mean, it's a plastic point and shoot film camera from the 90s, right? But the photos, at least a lot of them, have really stood the test of time for me. So I clearly only care about sharpness and so-called image quality up to a point. But the colors, the overall look and feel, the composition, the subject, the experience of using the camera, and how much editing is required to get a look that I'm happy with are all so much more important to me than the technical stuff, right? I would definitely prefer the images from that film camera to be a little bit sharper. And I do not want to bother with shooting film anymore. It's just way too much of a hassle. It's way too expensive per shot. I think I'm done with that, at least for the foreseeable future, unless something changes. But there was something there shooting film that I just don't really get with the digital files on the big Sony cameras. And with those, I can push the files around any way that I want with the, with the raw files, the Sony raw files. They're super malleable. And after years and years, I always got to a point where I think they look good, but I don't particularly like spending time editing photos. Some people love that part of the process. It's their favorite part of photography. For them, the Sony files might be a little bit better. I think they probably have a higher dynamic range, and they're a little bit more malleable for pushing and pulling, especially if you're doing some crazy stuff in Photoshop and using luminosity masks or just like lots of intense editing. But at the same time, I don't think that the raw files from the Sony cameras look look quite as good right out of the gate as the Fuji cameras. You can definitely get a Sony file to look great if you know what you're doing, but it's so easy to mess up a photo while editing. I know it's subjective, but I think a lot of times when people spend a lot of time in Photoshop or even in Lightroom and really rely on the edit to make the photos look good, they end up looking kind of awful. Especially if we're going for a fairly natural or like a lightly stylized look that's not super exaggerated and super saturated and whatever else, then these small shifts in contrast and color hue or saturation or white balance or any of that stuff can, in my opinion, just really make or break a photo. I mean, just look at the greens in a lot of landscape photography, and hopefully you'll see what I mean. In a lot of cases, the greens just, they look bad. They look either oversaturated or just like a weird hue that doesn't look natural, or just, they're not quite right. It doesn't have to look perfectly true to life. I think lots of different stylistic editing choices can look really good, but they can also look kind of bad. And so if we're starting off with a raw file that doesn't look that good to start with, and they're fine, but they don't look as good, I think. But if we're starting off with a raw file that's kind of bland and blah to begin with, I think there's a much better chance of ending up with a final image that doesn't look very good either. This is one of the things that appeals to a lot of people about shooting film. The process is mostly about getting it right in camera, and then you end up with photos that have a certain look, they're stylized, but they're not like super digital crunchy, not super exaggerated. And then you can make tweaks from there, but your starting point looks pretty good. And there are different film stocks that have different looks that we can choose from, but we're used to that look, and we think it's usually pretty good as a starting point if we choose the right film for us. And I get a lot of that with the Fuji camera so far, even without really like diving into the JPEG recipes side of things. Just the raw file with the various camera profiles applied in Lightroom, kind of like a preset, but like a really, really good preset that Fuji has made that's a fairly neutral starting point. It's just lightly stylized, but it kind of feels like I'm replicating the film approach, where I can take different, film stocks and use those, and I can apply it after the fact, which is a unique thing about shooting digitally. But I'm not taking just like some photographer's preset that kind of works. This is like one of the features of Fuji, is that they've built these camera profiles that work with their cameras and help replicate sort of different film looks. And they look really good. They look really good. So like, even without really doing any editing, taking the Fuji raw file and then applying like the nostalgic negative or the Astia camera profile, it's already better than like, I don't know, a preset that I could come up with the Sony. I can make the Sony files look good. I've been doing this for years and years, but like the Fuji ones look really good right out of the gate. And that's nice. It's really nice, because editing, it's surprisingly difficult. It's way harder than you might think to end up with good, consistent, natural, but slightly stylized results that all kind of work together. And it's way easier than you might think to overdo it and tweak one thing in the wrong way, and it just looks kind of bad. And so starting with a raw file that looks good, maybe with certain camera profiles to choose from, that's pretty valuable. And I think that Fuji does a really good job at that. And that's one of my favorite things so far. Some things that I don't care about. The menu systems. They both seem equally fine and like kind of convoluted. There's so much customization possible with cameras these days. So many different settings you can choose from that this feels inevitable, right? Like there's so many functions that there has to be a complex menu system with lots of options. But with both of them, once you set up all of the custom buttons to have the camera set up how you like, then you don't have to think about it again. So the menus are totally fine. Not a big deal. Like, totally fine. Some questions that I still have. How will this Fuji camera feel for landscape photography, or photography in wilder places more generally? I know that for walks around cities, for photography in cities, whether you would call that street photography or not, I like the Fuji system better so far. But we'll have to wait and see on the landscape stuff, because I haven't really used it much for landscape-esque photography so far. But I have a lot of camping and hiking and just outdoorsy trips planned for the next month or two in Washington, and then a little bit in Oregon and California. So I'm excited to try this setup on a wider variety of trips and projects and types of scenes. And then we can see whether this could completely replace the Sony gear. So the goal for me is to make interesting work, to enjoy the process, and to do it all for a very long time, often within the scope of long-term photography projects. So if this Fuji gear helps with that, then I'll stick with it. But if it turns out that the Sony gear was a better system, better set of tools, then this will have all been a fun experiment, and I'll go back to that. I am optimistic. but I do really need to give it a few more months of really testing the gear before I just sell everything and go all in. But I will keep you updated. Let me know if you have any questions in the meantime, but thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.